Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this panel. We hope you've enjoyed the day so far. I know I have gotten so much out of this conference and learned so much, and my head is just buzzing. And I think if your head hasn't already exploded with new knowledge and ideas, this panel is certainly going to take you over the top. I'm really excited to have these four amazing women here to talk to you about Native American land rights. And I'm going to introduce myself very briefly and then introduce them and then get out of the way for what I think will be a really interesting conversation. So my name's Ona Balkis. I'm an attorney in the Food Law and Policy Clinic here at the law school. And I've had the privilege of being the lead attorney on our partnership with Navajo Nation over the past 3 years and have gotten to work closely with Amber and Sonlatsa, who I'll introduce in a minute. So I'll introduce them in order of presentation. So Jessica Shoemaker, here closest to me, she's a professor, and her scholarship focuses on American Indian land tenure and its consequences for community health and vitality in Indian country. In addition to her work on historical federal Indian land policies, Professor Shoemaker is currently engaged in a long-term project aimed at creating legal strategies for a path forward out of the current problematic Indian land tenure institutions. She is also engaged in international and interdisciplinary action research on land use planning and community development through the University of Nebraska's Rural Futures Institute. Before her academic career, Professor Shoemaker represented Indian farmers and ranchers and other Indian interests, both in private practice and as a Skadden Fellow at the Farmers Legal Action Group. To her right is Amber Knezba-Crotty. Amber is a Navajo Nation Council delegate and a member of the Health, Education, and Human Services Committee. She is currently the only female representative on the council and is a true champion of food and food sovereignty issues. Amber, this is probably my favorite sentence in any bio I've ever gotten to read. I'm so glad I get to say it out loud. Amber comes from a long legacy of women leaders, strong weavers, tenacious sheep herders, and loving grandmas. Woo! Ms. Crotty studied American Indian Studies, Law, and History at University of California, Los Angeles. In her spare time, she runs Beauty is Restored Family Farms. Sonlatsa Jim Martin, also known as Sunshine, is Navajo Modoc, and she is enrolled in the Navajo Nation. She lives on the Navajo Reservation. She received her bachelor's degree from Colorado College and is working on a master's degree in public administration. She works for the COPE project as the coalition leader for a CDC REACH grant in Gallup, New Mexico, which she'll tell you more about. Her past experiences have included work in Indian education, human resources, Navajo Nation social services, nonprofit management, Navajo Nation Head Start, and in the Navajo Nation Department of Health, and in creating the Navajo Nation Department of Health. She leads the Navajo Food Policy Toolkit collaboration on the Navajo Nation in coordination with the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard. And then last but not least, Terza Tippin-Poe is a Inupiat from the U.S. Arctic and works as a third-party advisor for large-scale development projects. Her areas of expertise are sustainability management, vulnerable community and indigenous relations, land use, risk assessment and mitigation, and policy. In addition, she lectures at Harvard, Tufts, and other institutions on international environmental governance, indigenous rights, and collaborative development. So without further ado, I will turn it over to them.
This should work, yes? Okay. Hello. Well, let me just say I'm so incredibly humbled to be on this panel with these amazing women. I have been studying and thinking about American Indian land tenure for a little more than a decade. I started actually as an intern after my first summer of law school working with an Indian probate judge in North Dakota back when Interior was still shut down and off the internet because of the Cobell litigation. So I was riding my bike to the Bismarck Library trying to do legal research. And George Tabone, who was a Kiowa tribal member who was a judge that I worked with. I just remember him telling me over and over the importance of, before you try to sort of do anything about a problem, you have to really understand the problem. And so I will start this short talk with the caveat that there's still so much I don't understand. There are parts that I will never understand because I'm not a keeper of Indigenous knowledge, but also as a legal scholar and as a lawyer, there are parts of the legal structures that I just can't get my head around, which is either an indictment of me or I think an indictment of the system, right? That it's so complex that we can't quite understand it. I don't know if that's an indictment of me and we said hooray or the other one, okay, good. So what I'm going to do is try to talk for about 10 minutes or so and give sort of the overview, the lay of the land. But obviously I can't give the whole overview of this whole complex system in 10 minutes, and so I'm going to kind of try to find a few highlights to get us through. I'm going to focus on the history, the modern consequences of the existing Indian property systems, and the story of really property and power and Indigenous sovereignty and choice and their special relationships to the land. And then hopefully kind of start the conversation towards the Q&A about sort of where we go from here, right? If the system is broken, what do we do about that? So, as a property person, one of the things that's really interesting and important, I think, about the whole history of federal Indian policy is if you look to that history, over and over and over again, the federal government has used land reform as the tool for social engineering in Indigenous communities. So we've talked a lot at this conference about the relationship between property and power, and I think nowhere really is that as evident as it is in the history of Indian land policy. Now, we know a lot, sort of, I think we collectively, sort of the story of land cessions, of land loss, of reservations, of removal, right? We know kind of this history of vast land loss across the country. But what I want to talk about is once reservations were established and Indians, communities and nations in the lower 48 specifically is where I'm talking, were in these reservations, the most devastating land policy was this policy of allotment. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of allotment and what it means, and what it means today especially. So allotment was a federal policy that said, we can sort of debate the motives, right? But what we want to do is produce more Indian farmers. So we want land to be more productive, and we know how to make land more productive. And we also want to explicitly assimilate Indian people into sort of yeoman farmer, right? Into the Jeffersonian ideal of what we think farmers should look like. So allotment proceeded to wipe clean whatever existing land allocations or property institutions were in place in reservation territories, and then redistributed property to individual Indian allottees in parcels of 40 to 160 acres in this special trust status. Now, the trust status was intended with allotment to be temporary. The idea was, we'll give Indian allottees 25 years, they will assimilate, and then they'll be able to own land in Western ideals of fee simple title, and we'll produce all these productive farmers. Now, allotment was built on two important assumptions. So one assumption was that Indigenous nations and Indigenous people did not have property systems. So it was all just communal. There were no property institutions. There was really nothing we were wiping clean. We were just creating property in a vacuum. Now, of course, that's absolutely untrue, right? Indigenous nations had all sorts of complex institutions for property ownership and relationships to property and to land. And that Indigenous people needed property to create farming, right? That we needed to change the way in which Indigenous people related to land as owners as a way to incentivize this kind of individualistic farming. Now, of course, that's also untrue because we know in this room, I think this is a good audience who hopefully is aware that, of course, there are long traditions of Indigenous agriculture or cultivation, gathering, hunting food from the land, right? People fed themselves before allotment, but we thought that allotment, I luckily wasn't there at the time, but the collective colonial we thought that this would be the way to improve Indigenous agriculture. Now, all of the statistics show that allotment was, of course, not surprising, but an absolute disaster in terms of all sorts of metrics, but particularly the one that we were trying to achieve, the goal of producing and promoting Indian agriculture. Well, indigenous agriculture plummets after allotment because the trust status is very restrictive. We've broken up all sorts of cultural relationships to each other, to the land, to farming practices, and there's no resources, right? So the whole thing, this external system, fails to encourage agriculture. And the other thing it does is it's a land transfer. So allotment results in, very soon after allotment, although the goal initially is we will promote Indian allottees becoming farmers, very soon after that we start this process of leasing, where we say, actually these Indian allottees, maybe they're not producing at the rate that we want them to, and so let's start leasing this land, mostly to non-Indian white farmers, on the idea that it will provide rental income to indigenous allottees, and maybe sort of mixing in these non-Indian lessees will be sort of help our assimilation goal. Explicitly, that's what we did. So what happens is we end up with a lot less, there's land ownership, but less land use, because Indian landowners are now leasing their land, and we also sell a whole bunch of land through the allotment process. So after the allotments happen, then the federal government says, oh, we have all of this land that wasn't allotted. Let's call it surplus, and then let's sell it to non-Indian homesteaders. And so that's what we do. We sell 60 million acres get sold to surplus land sales, also justified in this assimilationist goal of we'll now intermix more non-Indians into reservation communities. This will promote agriculture and assimilation and break up tribes and sort of resolve the sort of terribly named, but what the sort of history at the time talks about. So this is going to fix the Indian problem. So 60 million acres get lost through surplus land sales, and then another 30 million acres are lost at this time through competency sales. So the trust status had a restriction on alienation, said you cannot alienate property while it's in this trust status. We're going to protect, we, the federal government, will protect this allotment while the allottee gets used to this form of property ownership. And then we started to take off that trust status, and conveniently, land speculators follow immediately behind the competency commissions and purchase up much of that land. So in the end, we lose 90 million, indigenous landowners lose 90 million acres through allotment out of 138 million that existed at the time. So left with 48 million acres of land after allotment. And this mix of ownership, right? So now if you think about, this isn't true of every reservation community, but a lot of reservation communities have this mix. This is the Pine Ridge Reservation. The yellow would be allotments. The purple is land that's owned by the tribe. And then the white parcels mixed in are the non-Indian ownership that's mixed in within reservation territories. All right, so this is what we have now, right? Allotment deemed a failure. We say that didn't promote agriculture. We lost all this land. It didn't sort of achieve any of the goals that we set out for it to achieve. And so the federal government said in 1934, we will just make the trust status permanent. So this protective federal government as trustee over Indian land will become a permanent status, again, just in the lower 48, as a way to protect against more land loss. And so now we have trust status. We still have trust status. Lots of Indian land. It's 56 million acres today, 75% of which is agricultural. Oh, no, sorry. So 75% of the land is agricultural, and the trust status is permanent as a result of the Indian Reorganization Act. Now, what I want to just do is think for a few minutes about what this permanent reality, or at least permanent as of today, of trust status and this mix of ownership of Indian and non-Indian ownership in reservation communities, what it means for land use and land possession. So here's kind of a quick overview of some of the modern institutions, modern challenges. So one is that this trust status is really restrictive. So the federal government acts as trustee. The federal government doesn't really create property systems as sort of something it's good at, acts as land manager. There's still a restraint on alienation, so access to credit. Any kind of land use often requires a mediated approval process through the federal government. So that is incredibly cumbersome as a process of land ownership. Now, a consequence of that is that a lot of the original allotments are now co-owned by a lot of people, which is called fractionation in the Indian context, which is that we've just got a whole bunch of people who own land. So after generations of intestacy, the inability to transfer property freely and consolidate inter vivos results in this high degree of fractionation. We're talking like hundreds or thousands of co-owners for 40 to 160 acres. Now, within that highly fractionated land tenure, one thing that the federal government has done recently has been to say that individual co-owners no longer have a right in their own allotment to make direct use of their property, but they also have to go through the federal leasing process. So if I'm a landowner in co-ownership with 1 or 2 or 100 other people, I have no right to possess my property unless I go through a leasing process in which the federal government gives me no preference as opposed to anybody else in the leasing process. And then we've got this really complex jurisdictional framework. So we've got tribal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction. This is the part I still don't understand. I mean, I understand lots of it, but there's lots of it that's just really hard, right? It's extraordinarily complex. Who has jurisdiction where, property by property, and even within a single property in certain cases, and I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. But let me just wrap up here. So I put this slide up extraordinarily delicately because these are what I think of as, or what I would categorize as the 3 Western theories of why we have property systems, or the functions of a property system and why they should work, or what functions they should do. And if we think about these 3 functions of why state or federal government would endorse a property system, none of them are achieved through the American Indian land tenure system. So if you think about utility, every economist who looks at the land tenure system and this cumbersome trust status finds that it's horribly inefficient, right? So lots of land use challenges, inability to access your land, the high cost of credit, all of these things make this a very inefficient system, and that pays out in challenges in land use and economic development in Indian country. Now, the other thing we think of is a human right? The sort of liberty, the right to have your own space, to make your own choices, to be protected from government in this way that this is your private property, our home, our private space. Now, of course, that's not how land tenure works in Indian country because there's this cumbersome federal process where every land use decision has to be approved by the federal government. And then the last theory is what I'll call human flourishing, or is progressive property or human flourishing, which says property is how we organize ourselves as people. And so it is our relationship to each other, to the environment, and it's this enfranchising tool that, in a democratic way, reflects our highest virtues as humans. And when we have this top-down system, nothing about the current trust system reflects indigenous values or locally chosen choices about what property should look like, which is really problematic, right? So ultimately, I would argue, we need to get back to a place where there's true tribal sovereignty, true tribal property systems. But how we actually go about doing that is extraordinarily complicated because you can't just create a property system overnight. Things have changed over the last 150 years. And so the challenge, and what I think the rest of this panel I hope is really going to stir up for us, is how do we start that iterative process of rebuilding tribal property systems? I'll stop there. Is that how I do it?
You can all there. Now you should be able to click.
Oh, very nice, very nice.
Oh, yate. That means hello. So yate. Oh, yate. Before I start off, I wanted to first thank the people of this land. I might say their name wrong. Massachusetts? Is that correct? Is that correct? How do you say the people of this land? The indigenous people of the land. I believe it said Massachusetts. Holahe. So maybe that could be your first assignment, is to know the name and the place of the people that you're from and that you walk among. And so as a land conference, what I wanted to, before I introduce myself and the purpose of my dialogue here, is does anybody in the room have an offering from the land that you occupy and in your space or the area that you represent? Did anybody bring anything? So I brought what is very critical for us as Dene in my pouch is taradin, which is corn pollen, which is our life giver, our mother, the creator for our existence. And I wanted to offer it to this audience. And so if my sister can come up. This is my youngest sister, Shadeja. And so if you want an offering, what you simply do is you make sure you hold it with your right hand, and then with your left finger, you give it a taste of your essence. This will be your historical history. Just put your finger in there. You'll see there's a lot of it. Have you all seen pollen before? Yes, 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 yes. So that's what it is. And then you'll get a little bit on your finger, and then you put a little bit in your mouth, and then you put a little bit right here on your forehead, because that's where your essence begins, and then you just give it a good thought. So I'll offer that to you, and so she will. So if you want it, just maybe go to table while I do this discussion. Because it's important when we talk about land that we place ourselves in the environment that we're in, and then we know and we recognize that the land that we come from can nourish us, and it can give us healing, and it can give us power, and it's our duty to replicate that. And as a Navajo woman, I know that I don't have a choice, but that is what the DN, our holy ones, have instructed us to do. And so as a woman, I will introduce myself as Kia Ani Nishle do Bilagana Bashichin, Des Chini Deshache do Bilagana Deshanole, She Amber Kinis Bakradi Yanishia, Tohat Soy den Not Sha. And so that's who I am as a Navajo woman. And so I'm setting myself through my 4 clans, my mother, my father, actually his mother, my maternal grandfather, and my paternal grandfather. And that's how we're connected through a people. And what I want to say too, to also situate ourselves, as a Navajo woman, our holy ones, our creators, those individuals in a perfect image produced us. And for Navajo, we were produced through ears of corn, the most perfect replication of that corn. And that corn and that corn stalk is our framework, is our paradigm, is how we choose and how we live our life in looking through that lens. Has that been diluted, and has that changed over time? Yes. But when we talk to each other in our language, when we give offerings to you and extend our kinship, we are reconnecting with our holy ones, and they are looking and identifying me, even here all the way at the East Coast, because we have stories as far east as I believe in Tennessee, and we sometimes do not know where our relatives went during the early trading and during the slavery trade of the Southwest. So that's who I am, and that's where I come from, and that's the context in which I'm giving my presentation. I do want to recognize Harvard. It was very refreshing to hear your your law school dean, talk about the importance and the significance of deconstructing symbolisms of power, maybe colonial forces, and how we are then turning that on its head and re-examining it. Because we need to remember space and place so that we can move forward. I want to just thank my newly found sister in the back, and also for Joe Gouldy from Brown. When she started talking about colonial sins, I said, that is the woman who is placing and creating this academic jargon so it can infiltrate your mind, so you can understand it at your level. But for most indigenous communities, that's what we're trying to say. And so I appreciate the keynote, because I told my sister in the back, now I do not have to spend my time educating this audience. We just know from what platform that we're at, and then we're going to move forward. So I appreciate that, because time is a luxury that we do not have. We are in crisis mode back home. You may or may not have heard of the Gold King spill that happened in our river, and it was caused by one of our trustees, the United States EPA, where most people feel that they are the ones to look to for help. They are actually the ones who polluted our river stream. And this year we may not be able to plant. And so I think that's when it's difficult to come to a space like this and really mistrust the intention and mistrust the reason. When we start talking about land trust, you just heard the history of our land and the history of the people. And so we are going to be very critical about the continuation of taking land into trust and how that will be used for the benefit of our people. So this report is produced by our tribal college. We have a college on our nation called Diné College, using the Diné paradigm. We look to Hatathlis, who are our spiritual practitioners, song chanters, our herbalists who canvass our mountainsides and our riverbeds for herbs that will heal our people, because we have the ability to heal ourselves with our own knowledge, with our own food. But this has been severely impacted by natural resource extraction, and it also has been impacted by the shift that we have experienced as Navajos. And the paradigm, or where we're centering ourselves, is you may not understand what I'm saying, but I'm going to put it out there because there's power in words. And so if my holy ones can hear me, they'll give me the blessing that I need today. So we use Nisahak es, not a ina sehasin. And we're looking in terms of how do we think about it, plan it, put it into life, and then reflect. And for Navajos, we do that using our 4 mountains. And so we started looking about food in the context of food sovereignty and food injustice. And so as I go along, you might, I'm not going to regurgitate what's going on in the slides. This was a community survey that Navajo researchers participated, and we taught interns on how to go to the community and do community-based. So this is just some of what we found in our community, but I wanted to demonstrate just the point of accessing fresh food for Navajos is we spend approximately, in this survey, about $300 or more each month in food. Now that may sound like a typical, that's the average, maybe just slightly below the average USDA monthly allocation. But these are individuals that on average are just making anywhere from $4,000 to maybe $9,000 a year. And so what they have to do then is travel from their home community, approximately anywhere from 50 to 75 minutes away, and roughly it's about 100, I would say maybe about 150 miles round trip. And so how do we talk about diet and what do we talk about traditional foods? And so our people on the ground know that the food that they have access to is hurting them. And so, oh, my time is up. Okay. Well, let me get to what I wanted to do was respect the conference and its title. And so I want to demonstrate our traditional knowledge and of food and our connection. It's who we are, and you cannot separate it. It's through our kinship ties. It's through our animals. It's through the plants. It's through the air. And we're glad now that current scientists are figuring out that animals speak to each other, but it's something you could have asked Grandma, and she would have told you that a long time ago. And so we have to get back to that grandma's knowledge. We have to get back to what we know and how we exist. And even in our teachings, where we just need to take what you need. So we talk about consumerism and reducing it. But if we go back to that knowledge, and you could see Grandma here has a very big pollen pack, and giving her offering to the sun. But so I'll end by saying our challenge now is a traditional food which was used for medicinal purposes in ceremonial times was corns, beans, squash, tobacco. And there's reflections of that all throughout our community. But now we have become a nation of flaming hot Cheetos. That's where we're at. And why are we at that system? Because of outside influence, encroachment through Spanish expansion, who looked and used our food as a tool of warfare. We had General Sherman actually signed treaties with, and you know that he, during the Civil War, burned the ground, scorched the ground to Atlanta through the South. He did similar tactics to Navajo, where we had complete fields of corn, squash, in our canyons be completely destroyed, and to dominate, to conquer, and then to move the people, where we experienced a long walk to an area that had no arable farm area, where we were forced as Navajo women to use our bodies to provide for our families, to be subjugated to going through horses' feces to find unprocessed corn to feed our families. And this is where you see the commodity of food come up, where extra flour, lard, coffee was introduced to the Navajo people, and just nutritiously, or how our body kind of uses that food, our body naturally rejects it. And so you'll see a lot of lactose resistance in our body, which is interesting because all of the WIC programs want to give us gallons of milk and nobody can process it. But this is where you start seeing the salted pork, cattle, flour, salt, everything that's leading up to diabetes, to health concerns, heart concerns. And so we know that once you control the food, you control the people. And so we are moving against that. And so I want to bring up my sister, Sunshine, here, so that she can give you a snapshot of what we're trying to do now to change the paradigm in terms of how we collect our food. How do we go against our livestock reduction of the 30s? How the Grazing Act, these are all federal grazing acts, basically destroyed our agriculture and cattle economy. And then when children were sent to school, how they not only separated them from their family, but then they introduced all of these foods that basically did not provide enough nutrition. And then this indoctrination that our own food, our own healing mechanism was somehow shameful, dirty, and backwards, and that the food of the conqueror was the food of choice. And so we get an indoctrination, and now we have grocery stores like Bash's in our communities, but our nation is the size similar of West Virginia. That's a huge land base. We're not talking about a park. We're talking about a huge nation, and we have just under 10 bona fide grocery stores on our nation. And so in this research, you can Google it. It's the Net Policy Institute Food Sovereignty Research. We did it in collaborations with First Nations Development. And what it talks about is food has been used as a point of privilege, a point of power, a point to continue to subjugate the people of the land. And now they're trying to divest us of the people there, because now we have almost a forced exile of all of our young, productive, tenacious Diné people who are going to the cities. And so we do have a lot of concerns with coal extraction, fracking, and I think now they want to reopen uranium. We have a long line and long history of uranium where some of our babies are still being born with uranium contamination. And so that's our fight, that's our struggle, but we're determined to at least recapture our food and our food system and our knowledge. And so I appreciate the time. Thank you, Onya.
I really hope you did the primer, because I don't know. They don't know how it's doing
Yeah, it's a. Shea Sunlatsa Sunshine Jim Martin Inishya. Tina Bithninshna. Al-Adana Bashichin. Al-Adana Dashnala. Do Ashihe Dashiche. Ayisi Totlakaida Nasha. Amado Astana Inshla. I'm sharing my clan, as my sister shared with you earlier, the importance of why we do this as Navajo people. And I think it's something the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic students and team have got used to when they come to visit with us on the Navajo Nation. And the importance of doing that, the importance of keeping our culture alive and keeping our spirituality and our connection to the Indiana, to our Navajo holy people, is really still strong. And it's great to have our honorable council delegate here. I have a lot of respect for this woman that is here, who is the champion for us on the Navajo Nation to address the food issues for our people. And as she shared with you earlier, we are a matrilineal society. I think just that in itself is a testament as to why we are at the forefront. Many of us women, are Navajo women, are Diné women, who are at the forefront of protecting the earth, the water, and the food. And it's no surprise that I see mostly women here. And when we get visitors from the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic, it is mostly women. I don't know if we got a guy yet. Not yet. So women, we are taking on this challenge of protecting the earth and speaking for Mother Earth. And that is Navajo. That is who we are as Navajo women. I want to just add to my introduction real quickly that Ona shared. I am here representing the organization that I work for, which is a nonprofit organization called COPE, which also stands for Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. We are a sister organization with Partners in Health based here in Boston. And if you don't know about Partners in Health, please look them up. They do work in 10 countries. One of those 10 is the Navajo Nation. We're the only domestic site that they have. And I also want to just add to that introduction that I stand before you as a mother of 4 children, and I am a women activist back home. And I try not to mix the two so I don't get in trouble. So I do a lot of activist work on my own time, and I do what I can to be on the other end of the struggle at the forefront to help my people. I do that out of respect for my grandmother. My grandmother is 92 years old, going on 93, and she was an orphan. A lot of that was a result of history, and she only speaks Navajo and is a traditional woman, and it's because of her that I can speak the Navajo language. My grandmother, in the Navajo way, we say, "E a yisi shenesa," which means she's the one that raised me. She's the one that nurtured me the most. And so I honor her and respect her today and recognize her knowledge that I'm sharing with you and all of our Navajo spiritual practitioners and our knowledge holders who have allowed me to have the knowledge I have so that I can share that with you. And I do apologize if I do offend any, and that's what we do as Navajo people, is respect our elders and our traditional teachings. One of the reasons I joined the COPE organization was to help finish a project with the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic. And this is the project that we were working on when I was an employee with the Navajo Nation Department of Health. This Navajo Nation Food Policy Toolkit is in collaboration with Ona and Emily. It's been a project we've been doing for the last 3 years, and it's something I'm very proud of because in the research we did recognize the Diné Food Sovereignty Report that Amber Crotty shared with you earlier. We used that information and did our best to incorporate it into a toolkit. And hopefully, we can get more toolkits. But I wanted to just share with you that one of the philosophies of Partners in Health that you'll see is they do address social justice issues around health around the world. And one of the things that they talk about a lot is that health is a human right. And that is what we've been working on through this toolkit, is looking at this complex system on the Navajo Nation and how can we get to areas that we can work on to try to improve the health system on the Navajo Nation, but also try to help guide those who use the toolkit to those areas that they can possibly make policy change in. It is a policy toolkit. It's not about programs. It's not about the only solution on the Navajo Nation. It's about policy, law, regulations, and how can we use this information to address the complex system we have to function in on the Navajo Nation. So this toolkit is available, and I'll go through it real quick because of time, but it is available through the Food Policy Clinic, and you can download it. It's a 99-page document. But the history of this toolkit really started with one of our tribal leaders who was a former vice president of the Navajo Nation. He is Mr. Rexley Jim, and he is a mentor of mine, and he also helped write parts and very critical parts of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so he is a phenomenal person who helped make sure we had a toolkit that we could start to have those conversations and start to look at the big policy picture on the Navajo Nation to see if we can help guide our people from grassroots organizations to high school students to college students to nonprofit organizations and even our tribal programs and our tribal leadership. It has 8 sections, and it starts with the Diné foodways. It talks about the structure of Navajo government, the role of federal and state government. It just summarizes a lot of this, and you're hearing the panel talk a lot about this. And then it goes into food production on the Navajo Nation, food processing, distribution and waste, access to healthy food, food assistance programs, and food nutrition in schools. The one part that I want to just really touch on before I wrap up is the Diné foodways. Again, out of respect for my elders, and also to make sure it's not lost in the work that you might do with tribal tribes, or any law or regulations you might come across to help with that address indigenous peoples and ancestral lands. But going back to talking to the knowledge holders themselves, talking to the indigenous people themselves, and making sure that you are recognizing their foodways and their practices. And you just saw one of our foodways today, which is with our Tkaradin and blessing, and it's very sacred. And the meaning is, it goes back to the beginning of time to us, this little practice that you did with the Tkaradin and taking a taste of it and putting it on the top of your head. We have many of those kinds of foodways, and they cannot be lost because they are connected to the land, the water, the animals, the plants. One of the things that we did and had the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic join us in was meeting with some knowledge holders, meeting with our grassroots people to make sure that we don't lose sight of this in the toolkit, or when we do take it to our communities or talk to federal leaders, that we don't lose the four guiding principles of Hojongonata is what it's called in Navajo. And that in anything we do around food policy, food systems, land, water, we don't forget the spirituality behind it, the knowledge of sustenance and self-reliance for our people, the concept of which is about valuing, being compassionate and caring for all, kinship, and also understanding its connection to home and environment. It's about stewardship. It's very sacred. From the time a mother has her baby in her stomach to the way the labor processing happens in the Navajo way, to when your child is born and the things we feed it, including breast milk, the significance of that act in itself. All of that is a sacred beginning to what we are consuming and putting into our bodies. So we just don't want to lose sight of those kind of things, and I wanted to just emphasize that with this group here. Just a really quick overview of those sections with pictures. Here's pictures of Navajo government. There's Rexley Jim talking in the top picture there. Just kind of shows that our government is similar to the federal government system. Some more pictures include just how a Navajo bill becomes a law. And we talked about the Navajo Nation becoming, or finally developing, a Department of Health, which is our public health entity. This is the process we go through. We also had a junk food tax that was passed, and a 0% tax on fresh fruits and vegetables. So that's the whole process that went through, and we can tell you lots more about that. We have this complex system is in this picture that I'm talking about, from federal, tribal, county, all the way down to the local government. It's very complex because we are in 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And this talks about the U.S. Farm Bill and all the programs that come to the Navajo Nation. And then these are just pictures around food production really quickly, just to give you some visuals of our land and some of the issues and recommendations that we are sharing through this toolkit. You can see all of this when you get a copy. And strategies around water. We also have strategies around land use. And we also talk about agricultural infrastructure. I'm almost done here. And we have pictures on food processing, aggregation, and waste. We have recommendations we've made as well. And then also meat processing is a big topic that we're having on the Navajo Nation. And again, more pictures of some areas on the Navajo Nation, some traditional foods. Food waste is becoming a bigger topic now. And then access to healthy foods, which is where the COPE project that I work for primarily is coming from. And then opportunities for more farmers markets and things like that in our toolkit. And we do have a representative from one of our coalitions, our grassroots organizations that's with us, and Sharon Sandman is one of our community members and an outstanding small backyard garden activist. We have mobile food vending that we're talking about and looking at a strategy. And then also we have food assistance programs that we're trying to deconstruct and make work for our Navajo people. And these include, SNAP and all these other federally funded programs that have been running and operating on the Navajo Nation for years, including FDIPR, the Women, Infant, and Child program with WIC. And finally, getting to the last slide, school food and nutrition education. And that's the key to everything that we're doing on Navajo with our leadership and with our grassroots community, is getting the education out there. Before we started this toolkit, we didn't have anything that was consolidated into one document. And when we did this and put this document together, we had so many people that finally started to connect land to FDIPR or school food to water rights. Everything started to come together in terms of policy and regulations that we can start to change. And it all goes back to, again, women, active Navajo women who've been doing this work, and then also our partnership with the Food Law and Policy Clinic, because I think we've heard a lot today and yesterday that food is a human right. So thank you.
So I always forget my glasses. Sorry about that. I just started having to use them, so I'm turning into an elder, maybe? Let's hope. Well, thank you very much. My name is Terza Tippin-Poe, as you heard, and I am really honored to be part of this panel. Thank you so much for all of the presentations prior to mine, because they really have a lot of depth to them. I had no idea what was going on in the Navajo Nation, so thanks. I'm going to look up those toolkits because they're quite significant. To document those kinds of things is huge. Whoops. Oh, you can keep talking. Okay, I'll keep talking. Okay, back to the script. Again, sorry about that. So I'll just, actually I won't look much at my notes, so sorry for all the confusion on that. This is my background. So we've heard that it's traditional to introduce yourself. It is, in my culture, the Inupiaq people, which are part of the Inuit people, the Inuit of the circumpolar north. This is a photograph from where I'm from, Barrow, Alaska, the Arctic Ocean. In the middle is my mother and her girlfriends as they were growing up. I like to think we look alike. So often people say, oh yeah, is that you when you were young? No, that's my mom. And it was just after first contact. So my people were the last to be contacted, really, in the Americas in the colonization movement that started right here 500 years ago. That would have been in my grandmother's and mother's time. So my mother was an Inupiaq speaker first. She learned English later on when she was sent away to high school about 2,000 miles south of Barrow. And I love this quote, the depth of indigenous knowledge rooted in the long habitation of a particular place offers lessons that can benefit everyone. And long habitation is key here. My people have been living in the north, in the Arctic, and doing business there for 14,000 years. We know something about sustainability. And I think one of the reasons why I was asked to teach at Harvard and also teach at Tufts and lecture at Boston College is because I continually, in my graduate degree at Harvard, kept reminding them that they had not invented sustainability. That we could work together on that whole concept. But yes, so we have a long history in my culture of sustaining ourselves. I think it's important to understand who a people are. And my people are about 9,000. We number about 9,000 on the north slope of Alaska. The Inuit in total in the circumpolar north is 160,000. So we're one of the smallest ethnic groups in existence. And so we know each other. Everybody knows each other. It's really true. And in my part of the world, in the U.S. Arctic, we're all related to each other. So I'm going to try, this is an attempt on my part, to take us from global to local. But before I do that, I'm just going to say a couple more things about who I am. So that's who my people are. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that although I teach and I've worked with the UN, the World Bank, I've worked for large multinational corporations like Royal Dutch Shell, TransCanada, in industry formally, my most important role is that I'm the daughter of Lillian Molly Hobson of Barrow and the granddaughter of Tirzah Hobson and Steve Hobson of Nuiqsuk. That is my most important role. I'm also a member of the native village of Barrow. So no matter what I've done in my life, those things will never change because I can always go back to my village. And I have many times to reorient. So it's not only Indigenous people who get the fact that we know how to manage our own land. This is a shot from Paris. I was an invited speaker during COP21 at one of the COP21 forums, specifically addressing Indigenous rights, energy development, and the Arctic. You know, simple, easy stuff like that. This, though, was a quote. I just loved how the new Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, really came out early on during COP21 and said, you know, we really can't have a conversation about global climate change and what we're going to do about it and its impacts on people, which include the land, if we don't have Indigenous people at the table and if we don't listen to them. So I loved his quote, very similar to the first quote I started with. Indigenous peoples have known for thousands of years how to care for our planet. So we have a lot to learn. By the way, Justin Trudeau just rocks. I met him, so I've got to say this, I met him week before last in Vancouver during Globe 2016, which is a big sustainability conference in Canada. And I was so stunned that I actually couldn't speak. I just smiled and shook his hand and went, oh, you're great. So good luck to him in his new role as Prime Minister of Canada. Another shot. So I'm taking you from the global, the Paris, just because I was there, and wow, couldn't believe I was. A number of forums were going on as they were negotiating the agreement over 2 weeks in a room. There were a lot of conversations around this. Here's a quote from Governor Jerry Brown, who's leading a group that you can't really see very well. It was South American governors. So these are Latin American governors, Brazil, Ecuador, and I think Peru. And they were discussing how they can really, you know, on the ground, implement some of the stuff that is being talked about in Paris. Here we have just a image, the Salish peoples of the Northwest of the United States. They were dancing. It was just fantastic. And it was a performance to call for working together. This was an interesting shot. I listened to Yator Kiptum, who is from Kenya, and he did a presentation on warning people in Paris that please don't enact a policy or an agreement that does not take into account the people who live on the land. And his background for that was pointing to the fact that he and his people have been turned into what they call now conservation refugees by environmental NGOs, something that's not uncommon where I'm from. Sometimes, unfortunately, NGOs operate like oil companies. They enact policies or they do things without even considering talking to the people who actually live in the region in which they are making these policies for. So this was his thought on that, and I thought it was particularly powerful, although my camera was out of focus. Already, the UN DRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has been mentioned. I won't go into that a lot because I've only got about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to jump right from UN DRIP, which was considered in Paris, although I would make one comment, not enough, in my opinion, from an indigenous viewpoint. So this is the Inuit of the circumpolar north. These are my cousins bringing in the whaling boat. It's a skin boat that they use for spring whaling. And it's in celebration. When you bring in the whaling boat, you've cut up the whale. We are hunters of bowhead whales. And so it's deeply embedded in our culture. We are the people of the whale. Thus my earrings, which were also carved from actually walrus tusk. So we exist off of whale, walrus, seal, and some berries to a very small extent. We are not farmers. 50% of our food supply to this day, right now, is from primarily killing bowhead whales, secondarily walrus, and third seal. The other 50% is imported foods. But all of our villages, all 8 of them, 50% of our food is out in the ocean, in the Arctic Ocean. So it's very real to us. Food security is something that I've got to give credit to the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the ICC, as we call it, which represents the 160,000 Inuit people of the circumpolar north. They've spent quite a bit of time focused on food security. I highly suggest you go to their website. I'll just say up in the upper left-hand corner is a painted portrait of my great uncle, Eben Hobson, who was the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and a visionary. In 1977, he formed the North Slope Borough and the ICC, and was probably the most significant policymaker in the circumpolar north at the time. ICC is now a advisory body to the UN. So these are just a few images. I've just got like a minute left. A few images of the people of the north. I think here's the whalebone. We are known as a people for using every bit of the whale. There's some of my relatives out with the dogs, dog sledding. There's the Arctic Ocean in a particularly what we would call ice-choked year. I was up there in 2012. Due to climate change, we have had a number of changes to our marine environment. Now, I'm going to quickly look at my notes here before I get off the stage and let you guys ask questions. I know I was asked to speak particularly about food security and land use. It's hard to do that in 10 minutes. So as I was putting it together, I said, I'm going to talk global, and then I'm going to bring it to local. How am I going to do that in 10 minutes? Well, I think I've gotten there, but one of the most important concepts, again, that was taught to me by my relatives is that food is not just sustenance. As our speaker earlier, the keynote speaker, Samita, I got that right. Thank goodness. Pointed out, it's a human right. which the ICC has stated to the UN over and over, but also it is our cultural centerpiece. We are the people of the whale. It's not just what we eat. As my uncle, another uncle, said, Harry Brower, and there's a great book that's been written about him. He said, the whales, they give themselves to us. That is our relationship to our food. They give themselves to us, and we're very aware that we are not the top of the food chain. We are not outside the circle of life. So I always thank my Uncle Harry Brower for giving me that, and his last quote, and then I'll stop, is, I remember this, at 4 years old, I'm at his knee in Barrow. He says, Terza, remember, you can't eat a snowmobile. Thank you.
Hello. I think we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to skip my questions and see if anybody in the audience has questions. You can raise your hand.
This is such an amazing panel. Thank you all. I have a question for Terza. So we've talked a lot about how we can be allies across all sorts of different boundaries. And one of the things that struck me that you said was that you work with multinational corporations and you work with the World Bank. So talk to us a little bit about what it means to work with capital, work with the state, keep your values, how to navigate that.
Great question. Thank you for asking that. I'll start with this. It's extremely difficult. And I'll answer with a story, because I think my Navajo sisters would agree we can't help ourselves. We tell things through stories. So I'm working for Royal Dutch Shell, and I'm sent by Royal Dutch Shell to help the International Finance Corporation, a subset of the World Bank, draft their Indigenous Peoples or Vulnerable Communities policy for lending to developing countries. I'm in a room full, half of it's industry, captains of oil, primarily oil and gas companies, and some mining, and the other half are attorneys and banking institutions. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to, they're fighting about the fact that if they put in writing how they're going to honor the agreements that they make, that the IFC is wanting to say, as developers, if you go in, you must honor these agreements and you must make them before you start your project. There's an interesting concept. Come to agreement prior to breaking ground or whatever it is you're doing. Anyway, lots of discussion. I'm the junior person in the room. I let all of my elders go first. And there's one guy, in particular, from Chevron, I'll just say that, who was really quite adamant that he was very concerned that agreements would not be honored by the indigenous peoples. How do we know? We've got a 50-year oil and gas project here. How do we know that the indigenous people are going to honor that agreement? We don't even know how their governance systems work. So that was kind of the last comment in the room, and then there was a pause, and I thought, okay, well, raise my hand. And I'd been thinking about it, and I looked around the room, and I said, well, first of all, we have a whole bunch of attorneys here. You have things called reopeners every 5 to 10 years. Let's have some reopeners. That solves that problem, if there needs to be changes to an agreement. To the second, and I think history will bear me out when I say this, I don't think it's the indigenous people that we have to worry about not honoring agreements. And that's all I said, because you just got to stop after that and let that sink in. So that's in answer to your question. It is very difficult. It was difficult when I was in working for Royal Dutch Shell, and I also at one point worked with TransCanada, to wear both hats, because I had a tremendous amount of natural empathy for the groups that I was negotiating with. I worked on oil sands projects. I worked on the new country entry for Greenland. not only in Alaskan Arctic, but all over the world. When I left Royal Dutch Shell, my portfolio spanned Arctic to Brazil, and then the new country entry into Colombia. So as Sustainable Development Manager for North and South America. So it's very difficult to wear both those hats, and it's one of the reasons I left, to be very honest.
Thank you, all of you. Very simple question. Amber, when you were talking about foods and foods imposed by the government, there was one line you said, traditional foods were seen as dirty and backward. And I wonder if you could tell us what some of those traditional foods are. Thanks.
Shema for the question, my mother. Some of what we consider traditional foods are different variety of corn, in particular corn mush that we'll make for kind of like a grits type of meal in the morning that sustains you, nourishes you. Matter of fact, we added in with some ash from our juniper trees, and in adding in that ash, that gives you your actual daily calcium requirement. And so foods like this, we have kneel down bread, where we have fresh corn that's ground and then it's put into a corn husk and baked in the ground. These are the type of foods. It's very common to make almost a pancake cookie looking like a bread. It's very dense, but it will sustain you when you're out herding or out with your livestock because there's very limited watering holes. And so these were foods that were processed in a way that that would not need refrigeration, that were portable, that were had high nutrition content in terms of grounded seeds. And we used prairie dog in particular. Prairie dog is similar, I don't want to say it's in the rodent family because I see people cringing, but it's a small animal that actually is our relative. There's a Navajo narrative where that's one of our lost children is the prairie dog. And so they have their own clan structure, and we would use that because they're out in the fields, and we would use that for our protein, for light snacks. And that has become very associated with this savagery because considering it was similar to rats or similar to other type of food. And so we see this huge disconnect from our food. And then what was replaced was typical what you would see from surplus from maybe like World War II or World War I, where the canning industry then needed additional clients. And so we talk about the Farm Bill, but these were highly subsidized government programs. And we now know that these have properties that are very addictive. And so now we have our let's see, my grandma was in boarding school, so I'm the second generation removed from the incorporation of our own food that would heal ourselves. We talk about diabetes. We don't have scientific proof, but we know if you start consuming prairie dog, your insulin levels stabilize. And so we are actually telling our elders and our diabetes patients to start re-consuming prairie dog, and it will normalize their levels, which actually some of our citizens have been able to get off of their insulin. And so, when we talk about economic development now, excuse me, it's unfortunate that the development that we see comes in terms of medical industry. So we have a huge dialysis center that's coming. Yes, that's going to create jobs, but that means our people are going in there, and the demand is so large that that's the industry that we see popping up. And so we want to counteract that with healing our land, healing our plants and healing our animals, and which will then heal ourselves. Thank you for the question.
So I would love to have this conversation go on for another 15 minutes, but we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our esteemed panel.